The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Media Literacy in a World of Echo Chambers.
Hello, everyone. It's Wade Franson back with another wonderful, exciting episode of Created in the Image of God. I'm extremely honored today to have a gentleman in the studio who is a columnist. If I get his details right, I'm not actually reading my script. He's a columnist at the New York Times. Now, the New York Times, I think it's called the Grand Old Lady or the Gray Lady. Again, he'll correct me. And it has a prominence. And therefore, he speaks with a certain gravitas on this topic. And I look forward to exploring the role of media and its changing role in today's society, the search for truth, the quest for deciding what is truth, as we've talked about in my podcast series, but also on my Substack series, quoting Pilate, what is truth? But, I think David's also going, I gave away his name, David French is his name. He's going to talk a little bit about media literacy and also religious freedom and freedom of speech in this country. We'll go through all these topics. Welcome to the studio, David.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So since I probably mangled your introduction and bio, please share with the audience who you really are and what you really do.
Yeah, so I'm a columnist at the New York Times. I'm also the co-host of a legal podcast called Advisory Opinions, which I think is the greatest legal podcast in the universe, but only because of my co-host, Sarah Isker, who's phenomenal. Also, I teach. I'm a visiting professor at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee, which is my alma mater. And so I do a lot of different things, but I'm primarily a columnist at the Times, and that's where you find most of my work.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and you're obviously doing a lot of great things. I live in Wisconsin. I live just outside of Madison. We did live in Madison for a while. I call that, and I'm not political at all, I'm really not, but I still call that the blue heart of the red state. And when you mentioned Nashville, I think, is it similar down there?
Yeah, Nashville's blue. It's more purple blue. Nashville is not like Madison. I've spent more than a little time in Madison. And Madison, some of my more conservative friends call it the People's Republic of Madison. Nashville is a very mainstream American city that leans left. And then it's surrounded by a bunch of counties that are very conservative. So overall, Tennessee is quite Republican. Nashville definitely leans left, but there's no Democratic representative from Nashville. It's been gerrymandered to where the only Democratic representative in Tennessee is from Memphis. And Memphis is a little bit more Democratic city than Nashville is. But yeah, it's a very mainstream city that I would say leans Democratic for sure.
And we're going to get into the typical flow of the show here in a minute, but I want to stay on this just for a moment because of the topic and what we just realized about our respective geographies. Does this, sort of painting of blue and red, I mean, gerrymandering has been probably going on since inception, but, it seems to have taken on, I don't know, a more sinister tone, or maybe it's more sophisticated. Certainly the country has broken down into echo chambers that has fueled a divide in which we, appear to be more divided than at any time since the Civil War. What's your take on that? Is that making it harder to get at the truth?
Oh, it's making it much harder. And gerrymandering is a part of the equation, but the bigger part of the equation is something called the big sort. And this is something that's been going on for decades. And that is the tendency that Americans have to move to places that are more ideologically hospitable. So red places become more red, blue places become more blue. And then as that happens, one of the side effects of that is that people become more extreme, because when they're surrounded by like-minded individuals, they tend to become more extreme in their views. This is a concept called the law of group polarization that was first articulated by Cass Sunstein, gosh, almost 30 years ago now. So we're definitely sorting by red and blue, and as we sort by red and blue, we're becoming more distinctly different from each other. We're gravitating more towards ideological extremes. And gerrymandering, let me just put it this way, gerrymandering doesn't help, but it's not the root cause.
Yeah. Well, I remember reading this book by Rich Karlgaard, who was, I don't know if you know who Rich Karlgaard was or is. He was like the editor of Forbes for a while. And he wrote a book called Life 2.0. And he was talking about how the internet has enabled more movement. And you could now choose the where of your future while still remaining integrated. And I think that, of course, probably drove a lot of this great sort and the acceleration of it, because in the American universe, business and commerce was always a leveler, right? Corporations didn't really get to be partisan. I mean, weren't really successful if they were partisan, right? They had to be more neutral, right? And not, right? Because their business was of making money, and everybody wanted to do that, wherever they fall on the political spectrum. But then this allowed maybe, a greater sorting. And then, of course, with COVID and the drive towards virtualization that resulted, is this probably accelerated?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is we have a group of people, sometimes pejoratively referred to as the laptop class, of which I'm a member, where you can work anywhere there's a working internet connection. And so we have millions of Americans who now have that freedom to work anywhere where they have a working high-speed internet connection. And so there's just a lot more mobility. And, also some of the corporate mobility in years past, it wasn't just a leveler, it was a mixer, a mingler, because, when back in the day, IBM, I don't know if you remember like how huge IBM was as an employer, and they would move their employees around quite frequently around the country. I mean, and one way I knew this is one of my best friend growing up, his dad worked for IBM, and the time came and he had to go. And he goes from, Kentucky, where I grew up, to Michigan. And so you had much larger military service as a percentage of Americans, and that's a big mixer. You had people were moving, they were engaging in economic mobility, looking for where jobs were, as opposed to ideological mobility, and that's another mixer. But ideological mobility is a separator. And so we have a much smaller military as a percentage of the population. You don't have giant companies moving large numbers of people around the country as much as you used to, perhaps. And so you do have sort of more of this ideological migration where if I can work anywhere, where am I going to choose to work? I'm going to work at a place that seems to really agree with my values. It's a very human thing. It's, in isolation, any given person, it's a very rational choice to make. It's just easier to live around people that you like and agree with you, and they like you and agree with your perspective. And so it's a very human thing, but when you multiply it out by millions and millions of people, it has some pretty negative effects.
Well, and that's the perfect segue to get us back into the flow of the show, because it was not always so. Where did you grow up, David? What was the world you were born into, and the circumstances of your, pre-conscious, not driven by ego or a sense of self, becoming David French?
I was born in Opelika, Alabama. My parents were Auburn students. My dad was in grad school. My mom was an undergrad. And I grew up across the South. I grew up in a little bit in Auburn, then Baton Rouge, where my dad taught at LSU, then Nashville, where my dad taught at Lipscomb, where I teach now. But then I spent most of my childhood in a little town called Georgetown, Kentucky. And if you visit Georgetown now, you would not say it's a little town. When I was there, it was about 8,000 people. We had 3 stoplights. Our nicest restaurant was a Frisch's Big Boy, which is like a sort of like a Shoney's. And it was a really small place. And then I believe it was my senior year in high school, if I remember correctly, that Toyota announced that they were building a plant there, a giant car plant. And so now you go to my little hometown and it's pretty big. It's got a giant, very successful car plant. You've got the satellite industries around any big plant, that are there. So it's very prosperous, much more prosperous than when I grew up. But yeah, I grew up across the South and spent most of my childhood in rural Kentucky.
Well, and what I derive from that is that you were in the world of academia. Your parents were perhaps a little bit better educated than some of the people in your communities where you grew up, and you were exposed to all that, even as you were traveling in areas of the country that are viewed by many as being a little bit more backward, a little bit more rural, a little bit less sophisticated, right? Some of those state names to us Northerners, or heaven forbid, somebody like me who was born in Canada and lived in 7 different countries growing up, right? I was not wealthy, I was not privileged, but the circumstances of my birth, that was my education, just, being in these different countries and having to learn the language, and that's kind of accelerated things for me. But so is that fair? Is that true that you were kind of a little bit of different from some of the milieu in which you grew up? Or
Yeah,
influenced by that elite educational world?
So my high school, again, these are, old memories, so this is roughly correct. But we had about almost 50% attrition between your freshman class to your senior class. Lots of people dropping out, lots of people. And that might be a little high, but in my best recollection is my freshman class was a little over 400 and my senior class was around 240. Only a minority of my class went to college, much less graduated from college. So yeah, I grew up to a child of very highly educated parents. My dad had a math PhD. My dad had a PhD and 2 masters, and my mom had a master's degree. So I'm growing up in a very highly educated family, but my family is from the rural South. So my dad grew up on a farm in Mississippi. My mom's parents had a farm in rural Tennessee. So yeah, my parents were very educated, but not elite in the way that you sort of think about the educated elite now. My mom was an elementary school teacher for rural Scott County, Kentucky public schools, and my dad taught at a small Baptist college. So it's not like I was growing up the kids of 2 professors from Brown or Dartmouth. It was, my parents came from a very similar, background than I did, the rural South. And I will tell you, if you've spent any time in the rural South, even the people who are most highly educated in the rural South, they do not adopt that persona. That is not the culture of the South. The culture of the South is a very leveling kind of place where people who sort of put on pretensions of intellectualism tend not to do well.
Right? And is the phrase that's coming to my mind traditionally liberal fair?
Oh, you mean in the South?
In terms of educated people in the South, they tend to be traditionally more liberal, they tend to be more liberal, but in a traditional way. In other words, their views are liberal in the sense of open and curious, perhaps.
It's tough to say. I mean, if you look at so I was born in 1969. I grew up in the Reagan era in the South, and leading the charge of making the South more Republican was actually the more educated. So, when I was growing up, it was the college educated voter tended to be more Republican, and the working class voter tended to be more populist and more democratic. And so
the union members.
Right. And so
similar up here, right? Union was a very big thing, and very blue, the unions up in this area of the country.
Yeah. Now that's not necessarily the way to describe your class of college professors in the South, but if you're going to talk about educated people more broadly, the Chamber of Commerce conservatism that was sort of part of the Reagan Revolution in the South was a very elite-driven phenomenon. It was this is your business leaders, your college-educated folks who, were really driving the New South revolution. Sort of, this was back in the heyday where in the 1980s you would hear that Atlanta is the city too busy to hate. And there was this sense that like racism was bad for business, right? That the South was turning the corner, and it was turning the corner led by a sort of chamber of commerce class that was replacing a lot of these backward racial ideas and backward ideas with a much more progress-oriented view of economic opportunity and things like that. And so yeah, it's very interesting. The political categories as they exist now don't track perfectly with the way they existed 40, 45 years ago. And one of the interesting elements of our current realignment is how the college-educated voter is just absolutely moving to become more democratic, and sort of the populist working class voter is moving to become more Republican.
Well, in case anyone in the audience is wondering, what does all this have to do with anything? That is what it has to do with it, right? Because these preconceived ideas, these categories, these labels, they influence us more than we think in terms of our ability to independently investigate reality, independently investigate what is true, what is real. Would you agree?
Oh, there's a lot. There's this old statement. I think it originated in maybe in the 1950s, and it was originally a statement of a principle of how human beings operate in bureaucracies, but it has a lot of resonance outside of that context, and that is the statement is where you stand is based on where you sit. In other words, where you are located in the world, your upbringing, your geography, your economic context, your neighborhood, all of those things influence us a lot more than we like to think. We like to think of ourselves as I am a completely free and independent rational being who has come to all of my positions in this sort of completely rationalistic way, when the reality is we're shaped by a million things, and our rational brain is sometimes the least important of them. And so our upbringing shapes us, our geography shapes us, our ethnicity and the experience of our ethnicity in the wider world shapes us. All of these things shape us to a great degree, and we have to often fight through those things to discern what the truth is.
Well, there you have it. Columnist David French of the New York Times validating why on the Created in the Image of God show, we like to talk about people's background, right? So, I mean, I think this is really fascinating. Are you a music fan at all, David?
I am a music fan, but do not test me on anything. Like, okay. I'm in music. I listen to music.
All right. Well,
I literally not only am I not like a fan in the sense of like being able to discuss music intelligently, you're going to lose me quickly if we dive deep into music, because I just don't know it at all.
We're going to touch the surface of, because I'm a fanatic, right? Especially about lyrics. So there's this band I'm sure you've heard of called REM, right?
Oh yeah.
And they had 2 songs, right? One of them is, which came to mind, is Stand. Well, there are 2 of them. One of them is Can't Get There From Here. You can't get there from here. And I think about how we're locked into our frames of mind. You can't get there from here. You got to let go of something. You will never get where you're trying to go from where you're at. The other one is called Stand, and the lyrics are, stand in the place that you live. Because you said, we something about where we sit, where we stand. What was that phrase again?
Where we stand is based on where we sit.
Where we stand is based. So this lyric came to mind. Stand in the place that you live. Now face north. Think about direction. Wonder why you haven't before. But the song is exactly about that perspective and being locked in, right? You turn to face a different direction and suddenly everything opens up.
Yeah, and unless there's somebody standing right next to you going, don't look in that direction, and pulling your face right back to, which is essentially, one of our issues in modern politics, is that either people don't want to look in that separate direction, or somebody a lot of people desperately don't want them looking in that separate direction, creating an enormous amount of sort of social and peer pressure to conform.
Well, and to bring it back to religion real quick before we go into the break, Solomon, known to biblical students as the wisest man who ever lived, said something like, one of his proverbs, whoever brings the story first, that's the one that, you know, if you're not careful, you will believe. I'm mangling it up, but if you're not careful, you will believe whoever brings the story first. I'm like, whoever brings the story first sounds very convincing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You've got to listen to both sides. You got to get the other side of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And what I would urge people to do actually is to listen to a intelligent person who disagrees with you before you listen to the person that you know agrees with you. Because what's going to happen is if you prioritize listening to the people who agree with you, then often what happens is you're kind of inoculated against the other side's ideas. It's like getting a vaccination against their ideas. And so that's one of the things, whenever you're exposed to a new idea, I tell people to listen to the idea's proponents before you listen to opponents. Because what often happens, let's imagine you're conservative and you've never heard of critical race theory before, just to take a controversy from a few years ago. If you're conservative and you've never heard of critical race theory before, what's your first move? Should you say, I need to, for example, listen to what Ben Shapiro has to say about critical race theory? Or do you say, I need to hear what a critical race theorist has to say about critical race theory, and then listen to what a critic would say about it? I would urge that as the course of action, because if you are kind of predisposed against an idea, and then you read a like-minded voice telling you, reaffirming all the reasons why you should be against this idea that you just barely heard of, that's not opening your mind, it's closing it. But if you've just heard of an idea, you should dive into that idea on the terms that its proponents suggest. And so you're going to hear the best case for that idea. And then go ahead and hear the critique. Go ahead and listen to the critique. You should hear both sides. But, you know, we often get it kind of backwards because we very much like to have our pre-existing views validated. And so we'll sort of go ahead and try to figure out why our opponents are wrong first before we do anything else. And that's kind of the wrong way to do it.
Thank you, David. We'll pick right up there when we come back after this short commercial break. Don't go anywhere.
Known for her sharp intellect and fearless voice, Anne-Marie Waters uses storytelling to question systems, spark honest dialogue, and champion the values that too often go unspoken. Born in Dublin and educated in journalism and law, Anne-Marie has spent years observing the cultural shifts shaping modern Europe. In Beyond Terror, she unpacks these changes with unapologetic clarity, offering a perspective that invites discussion, stirs debate, and ultimately leads readers to one unwavering conclusion. For her, writing has never been about comfort. It's always been about truth. Her latest book, In Defense of Democracy, has broadened into a podcast show in which it takes an unfiltered look at the state of our freedoms today. Through thoughtful commentary and fearless questioning, she explores what it means to protect the rights that define who we are and who we want to be. Outside of politics and public debate, Anne shares a more personal journey, one shaped by reinvention, resilience, and the pursuit of deeper understanding. Her voice continues to evolve, and with it, her mission is to connect, challenge, and create space for conversations that truly matter. Don't miss what's next for Anne-Marie Waters.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God with New York Times columnist David French. Right before the break, we were wrapping up a segment on making sure you hear both sides of the story, and that's the only way to keep an open mind. David was emphasizing, you know, it's really advisable to listen to the other side first so that you don't get into a situation where you and all your girlfriends already know the truth, right, about somebody else. So I'm reminded of my experience with my religious background, where I was in a particular denomination that believed that God must open your mind to the truth, that you couldn't understand these things. Jesus spoke in parables, and when you ask, well, why did he speak in parables? Everyone will say, well, because those stories make the truth more accessible. In fact, Jesus said, no, he speaks in parables so that seeing they will not see, hearing they will not hear, in fulfillment of the prophecies of Isaiah. He almost spoke in riddles. Why? Because they were trying to kill him, and he wanted to get the truth out without being killed prematurely. That's one reason, right? So you had to have your mind open. God had to reveal to you what the meaning was. That was our premise. So we wanted people to have an open mind until they had learned the truth as we saw it. Then we expected people to shut their minds tighter than a steel trap, lest the devil take away the truth that you had been open to. You follow me? And this began to really bother me, right? Isn't that kind of what you're describing there, when you gather your echo chamber around you and you become convinced of something, and then you're going to resist and oppose any other idea as being the whisperings of Satan?
Oh, look, you're describing what happens in any like-minded ideological movement. They're drawn towards orthodoxy, and they're drawn towards, fundamentalism. So, one of the things that a definition of fundamentalism that I heard that I'll never forget came from Richard Land, who used to be the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission in the Southern Baptist Convention. And he said, fundamentalism isn't a theology, it's a psychology. And which makes all the sense in the world, because there's a million different fundamentalist theologies, that fundamentalist Muslims fight each other, fundamentalist Christians fight each other, fundamentalist Christians fight fundamentalist Muslims, you name it. Fundamentalists have all kinds of different worldviews, all kinds of different ideologies, but the one thing that they do share is they share a psychology of absolute certainty, and that they have figured it out. And now, of course, if you run into a fundamentalist, they're going to say, oh, David, that's ridiculous. There are some things that I haven't figured out. But on the important stuff, we've got that figured out. And so in that circumstance, in many ways, an open mind is nothing but dangerous to a fundamentalist, because an open mind could lead to disagreement. This is one of the reasons why, no matter the ideology, no matter the theology or the religious background, fundamentalists always suppress free speech. Because in the fundamentalist mindset, free speech is a threat. It's not a gift. It's nothing about it is a beautiful gift to the world. It is a threat, because in the fundamentalist world, disagreement could lead somebody astray, and they figured it out. There's certainty. And so free speech introduces ambiguity, it introduces nuance, it introduces disagreement, it introduces dissent. And in the fundamentalist world, that is an anathema, because you figured it out. And so this is why you'll see the more ideologically doctrinaire and uniform any given institution becomes, it almost certainly becomes more closed off to debate at the same time.
So this is fascinating, because I often, almost like a schoolboy prank, sort of poking somebody to get a reaction. I won't call it trolling, but I will identify myself as a fundamentalist, right? So this is fascinating, right? So we're the founding fathers fundamentalists when they said and I'll mangle the quote, we accept these truths to be self-evident. And then they enshrined free speech in the Constitution and they said you have God-given rights, right? So, I mean, is there any fundamentalism in the way? And I'm not arguing with you at all. What you're saying is absolutely true, but the word fundamentalism is being used in a pejorative sense, whereas the fundamentals. Fundamentalism, maybe I think it was the 1910. Here are the 5 fundamentals of Christianity. Is is what I refer to when I say I'm a fundamentalist, because I believe in those 5 things, and I believe that the Bible is the Word of God, for example. So you get my point?
I get your point. I understand what you're saying. I would use great caution in labeling yourself by anything applying a definition different from the common definition. So, for example, I can totally understand that if you say you're fundamentalist, what you're referring to is sort of 5 fundamentals. Nobody else thinks that when you hear the term fundamentalism. What they think is a person of blazing certainty about whatever it is they're fundamentalist about, right?
Right.
And so it becomes, it reminds me of like, words are interesting in the way that their meaning changes, because if you're talking about the fundamentalism versus neo-evangelical debate of Bob Jones versus Billy Graham, that's one thing, and that's not the terms of the debate anymore, right? And so I think we do have to be careful when we're talking about what is fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is not any time you hold a view, right? Any kind of time you hold a
I get it. Let's not go into depth on that. Perhaps a better one, for example, would be what you brought up earlier, critical race theory, right? Is critical race theory in its results, or where the rubber meets the road of critical race theory and its impact? Let's put it this way. Does critical race theory achieve the aims of critical race theory, or does it accomplish something different?
I'm not.
You understand what I'm getting at?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Well, any term, right? Communism, for example. What does communism mean? And you could argue at the intellectual level, no, communism is this, and here are Marx's theories.
So are you asking, can critical race theory work?
No, I'm not really asking that, actually. I'm saying that the ivory tower ideal of what critical race theory seeks to accomplish, right, might be, compared to, I'm exaggerating now because I don't, but what Karl Marx wanted to do was certainly not to launch Stalin into power. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So
you follow me now? Do you get what I'm getting at? So
maybe. Okay. So here's the thing. I think that, so for example, with any set of ideas, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's Marxism, whether it's, I would call myself politically, my philosophical view is classical liberal. There is a spectrum of individuals attached to those ideas, and some of them can be extraordinarily fundamentalist and intolerant in the advancement of those ideas. Some of them are disingenuous in the advancement of their ideas. For example, they've latched onto it as a means to an end, as opposed to adherence to the underlying viewpoint itself. And so it's often very difficult to sort out sort of what is the pure essence of the thing. So you've heard of like one of the problems with, whenever you point out problems with socialism, it's like the problem with socialism is that true socialism's never been tried. What are the actual ideas that are outworking into the system is always, a key question. And do those actual ideas that are outworking into the system work, as opposed to, I have created this sort of beautiful worldview that if only I could implement this thing into the world, that everything would be all right. And so in that sense, one of the things that I think is a real problem, it's not so much any given ism, it's the extent to which the isms interact with another ism, utopiaism. Yeah, and so in other words, like I've got this system figured out that is going to bring peace and justice and prosperity and equality, blah, blah, blah. And I have figured this thing out. And so therefore, those who are against me on this are against peace and justice and security, etc. Right? And there we go, right? That's where the danger is. Yeah.
That is a critical distinction. We see that happening, and thus my my kind of playful, provocative declaration that I'm a fundamentalist to try to have that discussion. I agree with you. I don't want to be pigeonholed and have, suddenly people flaming me on social media and arguing that I'm this horrible fundamentalist because I said I was. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you got to be careful about that stuff. Like, I remember during the defund the police movement, the height of it. You would say, we need cops on the streets. And somebody would say, no. What defund the police means is really, and it would mean something like provide additional funding for social services. Well, say I'm for additional funding for social services as to defund the police if you don't mean defund the police. And so we get, it's funny, we get into this a lot, that subgroups have what you might call bespoke ideological definitions for common terms. And I just really try to avoid that. I just really, I try to use terms the way they're used sort of in the broader world. Otherwise, I'm spending all my time saying, no, you don't understand. This thing that I just said doesn't mean what you think it means.
And yet we do sometimes need popularized conceptions. I mean, I love Einstein's quote, things should be made as simple as they can be and no simpler, right? So, for example, I like to formulate this about religion. Religion must inspire, not coerce, right? The minute religion steps into the arena of coercion, and that's probably more what you mean by fundamentalism, right? This is true, and we want to make sure everyone else ascribes to and follows this truth. And that's not inspiring at all to many people. Some people are inspired by that. They want to get on board with that. I've heard that Islam is one of the fastest growing religions exactly because it has these concrete rules and do's and don'ts that seem to have been lost over time, in our religious circles in the Judeo-Christian world, right? And that's appealing to some people, but then that line is so fine and it's crossed so easily.
Yeah, I would put it like this. How do you know if you're a fundamentalist, sort of in this negative connotation? It is not, do I believe things to be true or not true? We all believe things to be true, right? We all have things, we all have truth claims, including existentially significant truth claims that I've never met somebody who holds a belief they think is wrong. Okay, so all of us, we hold beliefs because we think that they're true. That is not what being a fundamentalist is. It is foreclosing the possibility that you're wrong. That is the danger sign. It's that foreclosing of the possibility that you're wrong. That's what closes your mind. That's what creates, that's what yields to the temptation of authoritarianism. So it is not at all negative to hold views and to hold them even quite strongly. What the problem is to go this extra step of foreclosing the possibility of error on your part. And, certainty is intoxicating. And it's especially intoxicating now when people often view nuance and openness as weakness. So the more you can be certain about more things, sometimes the stronger people feel. But in many ways, that isn't strength. That's actually not strength at all. It requires an awful lot of courage to be able to say, I might be wrong. I might be wrong. That requires an awful lot of courage, especially now when we're retreating into our corners.
Well said, David. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to pick up on that I might be wrong idea, and then we're going to talk about this whole media literacy thing and where you're growing next in your work. And, I just got to say, this is fascinating. Thank you so much for being here. And to the audience, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Created in the Image of God with David French. Right before the break, David was very articulate about what he means by fundamentalism and why we need to avoid it, and always maintain the possibility that we might be wrong. So rather than a broad general sense, David, what are some things that you hold dear and close that you feel really convinced about where you might be wrong, and what would it take to change your mind on any of those topics? And I know I'm totally putting you on the spot here, but I thought that question might be fun.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think there is a single proposition where I don't think I can't be wrong about it. You know, I do think that there are propositions that I hold more closely than others. So, like, you know, I am a believer in the authority of Scripture. I believe that Jesus Christ was, you know, like, we could walk through the Apostles' Creed. I believe all of that, right? And so, yeah, and those would be some of the values and the beliefs that are the closest to me. They matter the most to me.
Wow.
And therefore, the part that I would say is, the more here's one way to put it, just to be a lawyer for a second, because I'm a lawyer. Think about it in terms of burdens of proof. Okay, so the greater degree of certainty that you have about X or Y or Z, that should mean in many ways that the greater the burden of proof at overcoming it. And hopefully you've arrived at these issues and these thoughts that you have, that you hold very closely, not randomly, not out of just impulse, but this is carefully considered and the product of lifelong, you know, openness and a lifelong quest for the truth. You're going to hold some propositions closer than others. And so the way I would put it is, what's the burden of proof that it takes to overcome that proposition? In some propositions that I hold more lightly, it's easier to overcome that. So for example, a proposition that I held, you know, when we began to first really start talking in the 20-teens about the prevalence of police shootings, I was skeptical. That was a problem. But as I gathered more information, then my skepticism tipped in I began to realize, no, wait, we do have too many police shootings. The weight of the evidence pushed me in the direction away from my prior set of beliefs. Now, is the weight of the evidence that pushes me from police shootings are not a problem to police shootings are a problem? There's a lesser degree of evidence than if you're going to push me from saying Jesus Christ died, was buried, and was resurrected versus not. It's going to take more than a compelling think piece and a set of statistics to push me to that other direction. And so I think the way I would look at it is, we all do and should have core sets of beliefs for which the burden of proof of overcoming them is very high. However, that should not be the default state of being for all of our beliefs. Then we should be reserving sort of what you might call the circle the wagons belief, okay, it's going to take a lot to break through this. It should be pretty narrow. That should be a pretty small core. And then the beliefs that additional evidence, new conversations, new sort of engagements with the world, opening our minds, that should be a much broader set of beliefs, that our default is to be malleable as opposed to fixed. Doesn't mean that we don't have some very keenly held core principles. But what I have seen, especially as we get more polarized, is that we're circling the wagons. We're creating this big zone where nothing can penetrate our set of convictions. And we're then calling that being strong and being courageous and standing, when the reality is that we're closing ourselves off into the truth. And so we're not standing strong, we're closing ourselves. And if one of our core goals as human beings is to become closer to the truth as the older we get, then we should have, the Christian concept of sanctification implies a lifelong process, where, God willing, you're closer to the truth than when it ends than when you begin. How does that work if we close our minds off? It can't work. That sanctification process, we will, through our own rebelliousness and pride, we will hamper that process of sanctification. So yeah, we should have, and I don't think I've ever met a person who didn't have some core values. Having those core values is critical. And for me, I circle those around my Christian faith. But at the same time, the zone of openness should be big. That zone of openness should be our default.
Awesome. This is fascinating. Thank you so much. I love that you went to those Christian values, which I wasn't expecting. And this whole unpacking of all that is just really, really helpful. I want to spend a moment on this, right? So I'm going to mention a couple things. This is a book, A Philosophical War, by my friend Joe Atman. You'll see the flags there. This came to mind on a number of things you were saying. He has a PhD in the philosophy of religion. One of the things this book does, which we're actually working on a reissue and re-release related to an acquisition of this Canadian philosophy company, right? But the core idea is that in the Garden of Eden, the emergence of consciousness and language is what's being described with that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam was elevated from the animal realm by the ability to form concepts, right? But the challenge is that rather than engaging with reality the way an animal would, directly, experientially, we're forming a concept about that reality in our mind, right? And so what I help Joe see is, Joe, you're really talking about idolatry. He hadn't made that connection, a false concept of God in your mind. Now, so you mentioned the Apostles' Creed and whatnot. So I assume you believe in the Trinity. Is that fair?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so what burden of proof is there that's meaningful? Because could you ever prove or disprove the Trinity?
Conceptually, in theory. So, for example, Paul talks about, we see through a glass darkly, but there will be a time when we see clearly, that we know in part.
That time might be moving into the next world, after death or whatever. In this life, in this world, who could ever prove or disprove the Trinity? It's a matter of faith.
There's what I was about to say is that there is an irreducible level of uncertainty in this life.
Yeah.
Irreducible. Okay. So if he says, now we see through a glass darkly, we know in part. That's what Paul says. Sure. This is also an Old Testament concept.
You're going to believe that there is a Trinity, but I actually came, in my religious background, we did not accept the Trinity. I'll just give you one proof, right? If the Trinity is true and the Bible is authoritative, then the Holy Spirit is the Father of Jesus, because Mary was with child of the Holy Spirit, right? We could argue that it's maybe how many angels on the head of a pin argument. I don't care. I don't want to discuss the Trinity. That's so not the point of this, right? But we could argue till the cows come home or Jesus returns, and neither would necessarily convince each other of the truth or lack of truth of the Trinity, right? You follow me? In other words, for us, the Holy Spirit was the power of God. It was not God, right? It was the force by which God acted in the world. It wasn't God.
Right.
You follow me?
Yep.
And it's a theological discussion, and in one sense, who cares, right? But you care, and maybe I care. I don't know. You get my point? The reason I'm using this example is really the practical application of this is what we talked about briefly in the studio before the show. The president held today some discussion on the findings of this Commission on Religious Freedom. And his position, and I only watched the first few minutes of it, was that he is doing a lot of good things related to religious freedom in this country and making sure that Christians are not
some Christians,
right?
His allies.
Well, Wait, didn't you just say you need to listen to the opposing opinion first? So let me just finish here. He's saying that Christians are being not biased against, what's the word I'm looking for? Singled out. They're being treated unfairly. There's prejudice against Christians. That was occurring under the previous administration. Now, you and I could get into that discussion about statistics and data and whatnot, and whether he was or wasn't, and back and forth. But we would probably agree that this country is based on and founded on religious freedom, and people should not invade the mental space and tell you not to believe in the Trinity or tell me to believe in the Trinity. And that there's probably not really any kind of proof either way.
I'm going to agree that, religious freedom is a foundational value of this country, and the government can't tell you to believe or not believe in the Trinity. Yeah.
So from that basis and that core, we move out one level, out one level, out one level. And then we can debate whether or not the previous administration did or didn't use government censorship on the media to force certain views with more power, with more dominance versus other views. And the question, I don't want to talk about whether or not this did or didn't happen. What I want to talk about is the degree to which we should or shouldn't have it happen. Isn't that really the core of the debate? Is, how do we encourage media literacy without it becoming something that encourages a certain acceptance of certain ideas?
I don't follow. How do we encourage media literacy without encouraging acceptance of certain ideas?
How do we, what this phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? How do we ensure that this truth seeking, this desire for independent investigation of the truth doesn't devolve into 1984? There would be those who say the previous administration was 1984, and there would be those who would say this administration is Orwell's 1984 society, right? Whether one is and the other is, or the other isn't, whichever one, I don't care. The point is, how do we avoid George Orwell's 1984 coming? And because the minute you try to stop it happening, you're at risk of making it happen.
I totally disagree with that. Well, I don't understand that. So the pursuit of an open-minded pursuit of truth is a firewall against 1984ism. And there are systems and mechanisms you can put in place to protect the pursuit of truth, such as, for example, free speech. So, for example, Frederick Douglass in 1860.
I get that. And I don't mean to interrupt, but what I'm talking about are deploying fact checkers to govern the situation such that you claim now that we have fact checkers, we have free speech, when the fact checkers are in the employ of Orwell's minions. You follow me? In other words, am I making sense? Do you get what I'm getting at?
I mean, if the fact checkers were in the employ of totalitarians and then had the authority to shut down debate, I get what you're saying. If the fact checkers are participants in the debate.
On Facebook and Twitter, they did have the authority to shut down debate. And there was government involvement in that. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Matt Taibbi.
Yes. Okay. So if we're going to get into this is very, very complicated. Okay. So first.
And because we're running out of time, I'll give you the final word on it. Yeah, let's get into it briefly and give us your response to that. And then unfortunately, we're out of time and we may have to have you back if you're interested.
So first, Facebook and these companies are actually participants in the marketplace of ideas themselves. So for example, Facebook can decide, like, let's put it this way. Let's suppose you had let's take a non-politically controversial company, Christian Mingle. Okay, Christian Mingle, their Christian dating site.
Is that non-controversial?
It is not. It is not. If I'm Muslim, right? I'm not being oppressed by Christian Mingle not having Muslim, right? So you have a right as a company, and you could create a company called Muslim Mingle, right? So Facebook, Twitter, all of these companies, they have their own First Amendment rights. So Facebook has the right to say, you know, we don't want our platform to be used to spread disinformation about a vaccine. That's Facebook exercising its own rights as a corporate citizen of this country to decide what kind of expression it in its own private capacity wants to permit on its own platform. Okay, that's one thing, that's one debate. Another debate is, when can the government go to Facebook and say, you can't host this or that? Then that's a different thing, because that's the government coercing a private entity. Now, what if the government comes and says, you have your own rights, but we'd really prefer you not to host this that's a whole nother thing entirely. That's the government using its bully pulpit to say, hey, we'd rather you not, but we're not going to force you. And a lot of the discussion around social media has conflated these three things quite a bit. And so, number one, from a First Amendment standpoint, the government cannot coerce Facebook to take down content unless that content is unlawful in other ways. So that would be a First Amendment violation. The government can, however, try to convince Facebook to say, hey, it's better for America and society if you don't have this on there. And then Facebook can choose on its own whether or not to take it down. That's not a First Amendment violation. And then finally, Facebook can decide on its own to be wide open free speech or to narrow it to some degree. And that doesn't implicate, there's no First Amendment violation if Facebook acting on its own wants to permit or restrict something. So we got to be, this is a very complicated constitutional area. And I'm with you if you have the government saying, you cannot say this, we're going to coerce you, we're going to punish you. That's a clear First Amendment violation. Guess what? It's also a First Amendment violation if the government goes to Facebook and says, you have to allow all perspectives.
Right.
Right. That's a First Amendment violation. So we need to be really careful about what are we talking about here.
That's super helpful as we crash land this plane at the end of time. I'll just throw out there that I love what you just shared. The second instance of Facebook, going along with what the government is encouraging is an interesting lens into why Mark Zuckerberg did an about face from his position with the previous administration and his position with the current administration, right?
Totally.
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind and not in the way Bob Dylan intended, right? It's more, which way the wind blows to anyway. But David, we're so out of time. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I hope we can, have you back on and maybe dive a little bit deeper into this and unpack it even more, because you've shared so many interesting perspectives for the audience. Any final last words briefly that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I think it's important to go back to that discussion that we just had about the Trinity. I think one of the differences you're going to have between sort of fundamentalism, this negative fundamentalism that we're talking about, and sort of what I would consider healthy faith, is a person who has healthy faith understands that that's what it is. They are taking that sort of, as Kierkegaard says, a leap of faith. There is a faith step involved here. And that the knowledge that you're making a faith-based step, in other words, in some ways what you're saying cannot be proven, like in the way you can prove a mathematical proof, itself introduces humility, as opposed to the fundamentalist view, which often doesn't acknowledge a leap of faith, instead just goes straight to the certainty, the outcome of the leap, which is I'm standing with both feet in this one place. And so I think that when you acknowledge you're making a leap of faith, just that acknowledgement introduces an interesting element of humility to your life, as opposed to if you're so certain that you're not even acknowledging that I've made a leap of faith here, that is where the arrogance comes in. The certainty, this absolute certainty, which in many ways almost results in foreclosing the idea that I'm making a leap of faith. And if I ask other people to join my faith, I'm asking them to make a leap of faith also. That's a very humbling thing.
Yeah, you can't judge. Jesus said, don't judge, right? You can't judge them for not making it if they choose not to make it.
Well, you certainly cannot view somebody who doesn't make the same leap as you do as an inferior human being. Denigrating them. I like the title. You have to view them, every single person you encounter, as a person just like you, is created in the image of God, of equal dignity and worth, even if they really disagree with you.
Well, thank you so much, David. We'll end it there and remind everyone you are created in the image of God and God loves his creation. David, what a pleasure and an honor. Hope to talk to you again soon and wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wade.
All right, bye now. Hey everyone, it's your host Wade Franson, created in the image of God. I have an amazing guest in the studio. As you know, we've been exploring the idea of journalism in the context of not bearing false witness. And of course, out of the mouths of 2 or 3 witnesses, a thing will be established, but those witnesses often have differing points of view. And in our fragmented echo chamber, cancel culture world in which we live, things seem to be getting worse. We have someone in the studio who has done something about it. He's dedicated his life since 2019 to founding something called Tangle, in which you can learn about these events being processed from the left, right, and the center in one place. Welcome to the studio, Isaac Saul.
Thanks for having me, Wade. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's been a pleasure. And you know, this sneak peek is being recorded just days after the Charlie Kirk assassination. And we're not going to talk about that per se, but we're going to talk about how the function that Tangle serves in an environment such as this, where people are just spinning this thing a bunch of different ways. How does Tangle, what is the role and mission of Tangle in covering a story like this?
Well, I think, first of all, our role and mission is to expose you to a wide range of viewpoints. That's what we do on every topic. So if you read our coverage about Charlie Kirk, you'll see arguments and reactions from people on the right, from people on the left, from people whose politics maybe are harder to define. And that's the number one principle for us, is the viewpoint diversity. But we're also just trying to be human. I mean, that's a core value for us, is we want to talk about the news like real people, not robots. So, we discuss the Charlie Kirk story in the context of a father who won't be going home to his 2 young children anymore, a family destroyed, a political movement that's going to be lit on fire by this tragedy. I think all those things have to be part of the story, and that's the kind of coverage that we try and offer.
Well, and thank you for that. So, in this sneak peek, we don't have time to get into it, but we will for a full hour live on the show, which will be airing October 21st at 8 p.m. Central. Meanwhile, before you founded Tangle in 2019, you did other things. What was it that led to this in your life?
Yeah, I like to say I kind of had 2 Genesis stories. The first one is that I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is a bellwether county in a bellwether state that decides the presidential election basically every year. So suffice it to say, I have friends, family members, colleagues, teammates from all across the political spectrum. And I just grew up in an environment where I knew and loved people who didn't agree on politics. And so I always was comfortable in different political spaces. And then the second Genesis story is I went to work in the mainstream media and I saw how the sausage was made and I didn't like it very much. And I realized that there weren't many media organizations out there trying to build something for all Americans, regardless of their political views, a place where all my friends and family could come under one roof and read the news. And so I tried to build that place, and that's kind of the mission I've been on since.
Yeah, the center does seem razor thin these days, and I'm glad that you're working on expanding that. The one thing we haven't touched on is religion. It's ironic that you used Genesis. I've recently been writing that there are 2 Genesis creation stories, right? Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 provide the perspective First, the cosmic perspective from God's view of him creating by fiat, and then the human perspective in Genesis chapter 2 of God kneeling down in the dirt and getting his hands dirty and crafting us personally out of the soil, not saying let there be light, but physically molding us. And we'll get into religion as well. There's a little bone I'm throwing to the audience who wants that as well, because there's, that's another topic where there are multiple opinions. So all of this and more will be being discussed on October 21st, 8 p.m. Central Time, Created in the Image of God with Isaac Saul, founder of Tangle. Don't miss it.